Delusional killers. Clouded minds making deadly decisions.
Hitler was there. I shot and killed him.
They are plagued by distorted perceptions, driven by false beliefs.
100% God.
How do delusions motivate those considered most evil? A scale exists to measure the darkest corners of human behavior. It weighs the criminal mind and the crime. From impulsive murderers to serial killers, this 22-point scale attempts to determine who are the most evil. Killers who are controlled by delusions can allow their twisted fantasies to lead to fatal consequences. Michael Owen Perry believed singer Olivia Newton-John was tormenting him through telepathy. He eventually snapped and murdered 5 members of his family. Philadelphia shoemaker Joseph Callinger believed he was on a mission from God to kill all mankind. He robbed, raped, tortured, and murdered. Michael McDermott claimed that he was trapped in purgatory. He believed he could earn a soul and enter heaven by killing his colleagues. He took the lives of 7 people. These extraordinary killers were compelled by the same phenomenon: bizarre delusions.
Delusional killers continue to intrigue me.
Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Stone of New York's Columbia University examines the cases of violent criminals.
The study of extremely disorganized minds provides a unique opportunity to identify and isolate some of the key factors that lead to acts of evil.
But not all evil acts are equal. What differentiates killers who operate under delusions? Dr. Stone uses the 22-point scale to evaluate the minds of murderers and measure the evil acts they commit. Delusional killers pose a challenge to Dr. Stone. Their mental illness clouds the motives behind their actions. To place this sort of criminal on his scale, Dr. Stone must closely examine their lives and their crimes. He begins with the case of Michael Owen Perry. 1983, Lake Arthur, Louisiana, near the Gulf of Mexico. Police were summoned to the home of Chester Perry, where they discovered a bloodbath.
I'll tell you, it's when you walk in and look at something like that, it just doesn't fit.
Grace and Chester Perry and their grandson were dead, shot at close range. In an adjoining house, 2 nephews of the Perrys had been killed in their sleep. As police sifted through the carnage, they found an important clue: a scrap of paper listing each victim and the name of pop star Olivia Newton-John. The note appeared to have been written by the Perrys' youngest son, Michael. The 28-year-old became the primary suspect. Michael Owen Perry was known as the neighborhood eccentric. He spoke to himself and was obsessed with Olivia Newton-John. The authorities launched a manhunt, but Perry was nowhere to be found. Little did police know that their quarry was 1,700 kilometers away, locked in a cheap hotel room, watching static on 9 television sets. Perry had once been a bright student and a promising musician, but when he was 13 years old, tragedy struck the family, and Michael began a long descent into insanity. On July the 19th, 1983, police in Lake Arthur, Louisiana, discovered a terrible crime scene. Grace and Chester Perry, two of their nephews, and a grandson, had been shot dead. Evidence pointed to the Perry's 28-year-old son, Michael, as the killer. The young man had a long history of debilitating mental illness.
The vicious crimes of Michael Owen Perry are a reaction to the confusion he experiences. He consistently misperceives the world around him and constructs an elaborate and evolving delusion to explain these bizarre experiences. An examination of his past reveals the source of these misperceptions.
1968. 13-year-old Michael Owen Perry was the youngest of 3 children, a good student and a talented musician. He played in a popular local band called The Great Pretenders, but then came a terrible blow. Perry's brother Ronnie died in a work-related accident. The loss devastated the family, especially Michael's sister. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and committed to a mental institution. Michael had difficulty coping as well. He told neighbors that his dead brother was on holiday in Britain. Eventually, he joined his sister in the psychiatric hospital.
The death of Perry's brother reveals not only a tight family bond, but a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia. A devastating neurological disorder, schizophrenia attacks the brain, twists perceptions, and produces delusional thoughts. While the exact cause of the disease is unknown, research reveals that genetics plays a role. Close family members of schizophrenics are several times more likely to develop the disorder. While Perry is not diagnosed at this time, soon after, he begins to display symptoms of the disease.
Perry escaped from the mental hospital and retreated to a world inside his head. He spent hours watching television and developed an obsession with singer and actress Olivia Newton-John. He wrote letters to her, sharing details of his life.
My mother gave me a copy of People magazine, which you were in. Noises from outside causes interference from your messages. If you are not real, some Disneyland puppet, then I will take those matters into my own.
Perry became convinced that Newton-John possessed supernatural powers. He heard voices and believed they were telepathic messages from her. He cut down all the trees in his parents' back garden to eliminate interference with these perceived transmissions.
Auditory hallucinations, or hearing voices, is often one of the first symptoms experienced by individuals developing schizophrenia. Michael Perry appears to be in the early stages of the disease. Often imagined as radio or television transmissions, voices are actually internal thoughts and memories that are perceived to be coming from the outside.
Perry's perceptions became increasingly detached from reality. He saw a resemblance between the eyes of Olivia Newton-John and those of his mother, and at times confused the two. At one point he realized his mistake, then flew into a rage and severely beat his mother. His confusion turned to paranoia. Perry assembled empty packages and mailed them to himself to see if he was under surveillance. As his delusions deepened, he imagined that Newton-John communicated with him by changing the color of her eyes. His delusions grew darker. He began to see rotting corpses rising through cracks in the floorboards, and concluded that Newton-John was responsible. Perry traveled to Malibu, California, to confront his imagined tormentor. For days, he lived rough in a wood near her home. Repeatedly, he attempted to enter her gated estate and was turned away by guards. Unable to contact the singer, he was devastated.
Perry reacts to his getting turned away in Malibu as a rejection at the hands of the woman who was both the central figure in his delusional scheme and the focus of his twisted energies. Now, isolated more than ever, Perry spirals out of control and loses all connection with reality. He flies into a psychotic rage.
Perry returned to Louisiana and turned his anger on his family. He broke into his cousin's home and shot them with a pistol as they lay sleeping. Then he walked next door to his parents' house and quietly awaited their return. When they arrived, Perry shot his father, mother, and nephew with a shotgun. The young man fled to Washington, D.C. and sought refuge in a cheap hotel. He acquired 9 televisions and played nothing but static on them. He wrote cryptic messages on the screens, including the names of his 5 victims. Later, he explained that static was the only thing that had made sense to him. 2 weeks after the murders, Perry was arrested for stealing a radio, and police realized he was the person wanted for the multiple murders in Louisiana. Even though he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a state court found him competent to stand trial. Perry was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to death. On appeal, he was found legally insane, and his sentence was commuted to life in prison.
I'm 100% God. I made it 90 years ago. And my job is to help the whole wide world as much as I can.
Perry still experiences frequent delusions, and doctors consider his severe form of schizophrenia to be incurable.
While Perry is criminally responsible for his actions, his fractured delusional mind must be taken into consideration when placing him on my scale. Killers of equal brutality, whose faculties are not compromised, belong at level 8 or higher on my scale. Because Perry's mind is gripped by a disjointed reality, I place him at level 7, paranoid killers with a psychotic core.
Michael Perry lives in a world far different to that of healthy individuals. Some medical researchers are trying to shed light on the source of the delusions suffered by schizophrenics.
I've always been interested in how the brain creates the reality that we live in.
Dr. Stephen Taylor is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Michigan. He studies the way schizophrenics experience the world.
Schizophrenia is marked by a profound disruption in the normal ability to form reality. Things that we normally understand and interpret can take on an ominous significance.
To examine their distorted reality, Dr. Taylor studied 23 schizophrenics and 15 healthy control subjects. He focused on the medial prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain that creates our internal reality.
When you encounter another individual, we make very rapid judgments. What that person is in our life, how we think about them, how we think they're thinking about us. So all this information is processed in the medial prefrontal cortex.
If Dr. Taylor is correct, schizophrenics should show abnormal activity in this part of the brain.
This next sequence will run for approximately 4 minutes.
Subjects were shown a series of images intended to activate the medial prefrontal cortex.
We used a set of pictures that were pleasant things to look at, and then we looked at things that were not so pleasant to look at.
An MRI scan showed how the subjects' brains responded. The results were intriguing. Dr. Taylor discovered that healthy individuals showed activity in the medial prefrontal cortex when looking at positive images. The schizophrenics had the opposite response. They showed extremely high activity when viewing negative images.
What we're seeing here is that patients who have more hallucinations and delusions are responding more in the medial frontal cortex than people who have fewer or no hallucinations and delusions.
Dr. Taylor believes that the medial prefrontal cortexes of schizophrenics do not function properly, and that it is this dysfunction that causes distorted reality and delusions.
These patients may have been using this part of their brain inappropriately in response to looking at the negative pictures. One possibility is that they were making inappropriate associations, seeing meaning where there is no meaning. For example, looking at the television and believing that the person on the television is talking to them directly. It's an association with that image on the television, but it's completely false.
Dr. Taylor's study may offer new insight into the source of schizophrenics' delusional thinking. But schizophrenia alone does not make an individual violent. Personality disorders, when combined with other factors such as parental abuse, can sometimes lead to delusional violence, suicide, or even murder, as in the case of Joseph Callinger. 1975. Shoemaker Joseph Callinger embarked on what he believed was a mission from God. Accompanied by his 13-year-old son, he prowled the streets of New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Baltimore in search of victims, single women and housewives. Once he'd identified a target, he'd use his son to gain entry to her house. Then tie up his victim. As his son robbed the house, Callinger would strip the woman, threaten her with a knife, and sexually assault her.
Like other delusional killers, Callinger's crimes are motivated by disjointed and bizarre beliefs. What distinguishes Callinger, however, is his scheming nature and the torture to which he subjects his victims.
Even after a series of such robberies and assaults, Callinger continued to elude capture. To fully understand his crimes, Dr. Stone examined Callinger's history.
While his delusional beliefs influence his perception, there appear to be other forces that motivate his behavior, forces that become manifest at an early age.
Joe Callinger grew up in an abusive household in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the 1940s. Taken in at the age of 4 by a Duo Austrian couple, he was soon put to work in his adoptive parents' shoe repair business. They forbade him from playing with other children, threatened to return him when he misbehaved, and struck him with shoemaking tools to punish him. Young Joe developed a temper and frequently incurred his parents' wrath. He stole from classmates, threatened one child with a knife, and became obsessed with fire. He began to believe that he was possessed by a spirit that made him misbehave.
Like many serial killers, Callinger suffers abuse at the hands of his parents. This cruelty seems to aggravate the antisocial and psychopathic tendencies that were already present at an early age.
As an adult, Callinger tried to control his destructive behavior and strove for normality. He married and started a family, became a skilled cobbler, and took over his adoptive parents' business. The business grew as customers sought out Callinger's expert craftsmanship. But he also began to develop a new delusion, that the heel of the foot was the key to maintaining the health of the brain. By properly adjusting the heels of his shoes, he could control his own erratic behavior. He began hallucinating, hearing a voice that he believed to be God's. The voice commanded him to begin a special mission. He was to save the world by perfecting his special shoes, thus curing those afflicted with mental illness.
Callinger is experiencing classic symptoms of schizophrenia: bizarre magical thinking and hearing voices. It is not uncommon for schizophrenics to interpret these voices they experience as communications from God.
Callinger became convinced that he possessed telepathic powers. He also began experimenting on hamsters in an attempt to increase their intelligence. When that didn't work, he blamed the hamsters for ignoring his instructions and forced them to run on a wheel until they died of exhaustion. Callinger also felt he was losing control of his children and that they were undermining his authority. Some of them had begun committing petty crimes. Like his adoptive parents, Callinger administered abusive punishments, but justified them as a re-education plan sanctioned by God. In 1972, 3 of his children reported the abuse to police. Callinger was arrested and sent to a psychiatric institute where doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia. Even so, he was convicted of child abuse, but a few months later, his children recanted and the conviction was overturned. Soon afterwards, one of his sons went missing. Although police suspected Callinger was responsible, they were unable to prove it. In early 1974, Callinger concluded that all of his strange experiments were failures. Despondent, he awaited further instruction from God. It was at this point that he heard what he believed was a new directive: to kill all mankind. Joseph Callinger suffered an abusive childhood and repeated the sins of his parents by abusing his own children. His behavior became increasingly antisocial and delusional in his 30s, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia at the age of 35. Callinger believed that God spoke directly to him, at one point commanding him to destroy everyone on Earth. Enlisting the help of his 13-year-old son, Michael, Callinger embarked on a crime spree. He broke into homes, then robbed and tortured his female victims. In 1975, Callinger put the final phase of his plan to kill all mankind into action. While robbing a house, he took a woman to the cellar and slashed her throat. She bled to death. Callinger was arrested 10 days after the crime and eventually convicted of robbery, rape, and murder. His son pleaded guilty to robbery and was placed in a criminal institution for juveniles. While in prison, Callinger claimed to have murdered 2 others, a neighborhood boy and his missing son. Dr. Stone considers the childhood history, madness, and crimes of Joseph Callinger.
Callinger is a rare specimen, the sadistic delusional killer capable of inflicting great pain upon his victims. Because of the cunning, predatory nature of his crimes and the torture he subjected some of his victims to, I place him at level 20 on my scale.
Callinger was sentenced to life in prison, where he spent part of his sentence repairing the shoes of fellow inmates. He died there of heart failure in 2000. Like many delusional killers, Callinger suffered from schizophrenia, but not all schizophrenics are violent. Researchers are trying to pinpoint the factors that cause the mentally ill to become violent.
What we're trying to do here is go a step beyond just establishing a relationship between schizophrenia and violence.
Robert Shug is a researcher in the Department of Psychology at the University of Southern California.
What we want to do is see if we can focus in upon particular factors that would cause an individual with schizophrenia to be violent.
Shug studied a group of subjects with a history of violence who suffered from both schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. He believes the latter condition may be the factor that pushes many schizophrenics over the edge.
The main element that characterizes antisocial personality disorder is a blatant disregard for the rights and welfare of others. These people don't follow rules, they consistently break laws, and they won't display any remorse for the things that they've done.
Shug thinks that people who suffer from both conditions are a distinct group prone to violent behavior. To test his theory, he conducted a simple experiment that focused on a crucial region of the brain, the prefrontal cortex.
We get these very intense impulses coming from lower areas of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex says, no, I will not act out on these impulses. It really keeps us on a day-to-day basis from acting out violently. It's the brakes on the car.
If his theory is correct, individuals with both mild schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder should exhibit an abnormality in their prefrontal cortexes. Subjects were told that they would hear a series of tones.
Whenever anything new enters our environment, our bodies will react on a biological level. When the participant hears the stimulus in his headphone, his body will react with that sort of what is it response.
The subjects' bodies responded by producing a small amount of perspiration, which was measured by electrodes on their fingers. These reactions are controlled by the prefrontal cortex. The more a person perspires, the more activity in their prefrontal cortex. When subjects acclimatized to one tone, a more alarming sound was produced.
What we want to see is if their bodies will respond to more socially meaningful sounds.
As he suspected, subjects with both conditions showed lower responses than the control subjects, indicating a deficit in the prefrontal cortex.
The brains of these individuals are wired differently. So if you get a group of individuals where their prefrontal cortex is not functioning, they may be more likely to commit violent acts because they're incapable of stopping the impulses to do so.
Shug believes that this kind of diminished function in the prefrontal cortex may make individuals who suffer from paranoid delusions more likely to act out in response to them, with potentially lethal consequences.
What we're doing here is looking at the more extreme forms of these symptoms as they possibly occur together. Schizophrenia-type symptoms, antisocial symptoms. Looking at this group and seeing if perhaps they're more at risk for committing violent or criminal acts. When we've looked at some of the initial data from the more criminal and more violent individuals, we've found that we see significantly more of the schizophrenia spectrum symptoms, as well as significantly more of the antisocial symptoms. In the end, what may be happening here is that these folks are taking a double hit. They're experiencing the deficits associated with the schizophrenia-like symptoms. They're also experiencing the symptoms associated with the antisocial personality symptoms. They're in essence at a double risk for acting out violently in a criminal fashion or antisocially. What we're hypothesizing is that individuals with both conditions together will demonstrate responses that are even more abnormal than both condition alone. With antisocial personality disorder, this is really a pattern of behavior that relates to a persistent violation of the rights and welfare of others. And what you'll see is individuals who fail to conform to laws, to social norms, to rules. They're also very deceitful. They tend to lie a lot. They're impulsive. They fail to plan ahead. They don't think before they act. They tend to be irritable and aggressive. They tend to be reckless, really careless, disregard for the safety of others. Also, they're irresponsible. They tend not to live up to their obligations, and they clearly lack remorse. They are not sorry for the things they've done.
Shug's research offers insight into what may drive violent schizophrenics like Joseph Callinger. From an early age, Callinger exhibited antisocial behavior. As an adult, schizophrenia destabilized his violence-prone mind, which created a vicious and remorseless killer. But not all delusional killers suffer from schizophrenia. In fact, there are many causes of delusional thinking, and there are many kinds of delusional killers.
These are very troubled times. There are wars and rumors of wars going on.
Leonard Lake was paranoid. The former Marine and survivalist built an underground bunker in Northern California to prepare for what he believed was an impending nuclear holocaust. And Lake's twisted fantasy didn't end there.
But the main emphasis of the building will be a jail cell, if you will, and the purpose of that cell will be the imprisonment of a young lady.
The purpose of Lake's delusional scheme: to keep sex slaves, which he would use to repopulate the earth.
What I want is an off-the-shelf sex partner. I want to be able to use a woman whenever and however I want.
Lake was responsible for the abduction and murder of up to 25 people. He videotaped the rape and torture of 2 of his female victims. When he was finally arrested, Lake swallowed 2 cyanide capsules he always kept with him, and died a few days later as a result.
Leonard Lake does not fit the classic notion of delusion driven by mental illness. The extreme twist of his personality is rooted in egocentrism and hatred of women. One of the most evil killers of our time, Lake belongs at the top of my scale, 22.
Austin, Texas. Diana Dial, a mother of 2, lived in fear. She believed she was being pursued by a group of assassins. In 1992, Dial's husband divorced her and received custody of their 2 children. Diana rented a room from Jack Farris, a retired businessman, and wrote long, rambling letters to authorities detailing the imagined plot against her. Eventually, Dial became convinced that Farris worked for the group that was pursuing her. She also believed he had been paid to carry out the Oklahoma City bombings, and that she would be his next victim. Dial shot and killed Farris one morning while he was reading the newspaper at his kitchen table.
Diana Dial appears to suffer from delusional disorder, a rare mental illness that in some ways resembles schizophrenia. She believes that she is justified in her actions and is convinced there was a larger conspiracy to destroy her. I place her at level 7 on my scale.
Like Diana Dial, Colin Ferguson fell into the grip of paranoid delusions. 1993. A gunman opened fire on a suburban New York commuter train, killing 6 and wounding 19. The killer was subdued by passengers. After his arrest, it was discovered that Ferguson, a Jamaican immigrant, was frustrated by his lack of professional success, and that he suffered from a powerful delusion, that all of society was conspiring against him because of his race.
What did you do? Why did you shoot those people, Colin?
He also said the government had implanted a computer chip in his brain. Ferguson refused to enter an insanity plea and won the right to represent himself in court. By studying videotape of Ferguson's trial, Dr. Stone attempted to uncover the cause and extent of his delusion.
At the time that Mr. Ferguson was on the train, like any other passenger, he dozed off, having the weapon in a bag. At that point, someone opened the bag, took the weapon out of the bag, and proceeded to shoot. This is a case of stereotype victimization of a black man and subsequent conspiracy to destroy him.
Ferguson's court performance is impressive. He displays a solid grasp of legal process and in turn adopts the language and mannerisms of a seasoned defense attorney. He truly believes that he is not responsible for the massacre and challenges the accounts of his victims.
He looked me dead in the eye and pointed the gun, and with the most serious look I have ever seen on anyone's face, he shot me in the chest. After being shot, I played dead.
Is it your testimony that the defendant Ferguson stood right in front of you and shot you?
You weren't right in front of me. You were about 10 to 12 feet away. Approximately distance we're at about now.
The only time you have seen the suspect is on TV because you were playing dead, am I correct?
I saw you shoot me, and I've seen you on TV.
Ferguson's referring to himself in the third person, even when confronting his victims, is noteworthy. This may be an attempt of his delusional mind to distance himself from the brutal acts he has committed. The delusion becomes more apparent as Ferguson makes a point in the courtroom that he believes will support his claim of innocence.
There were 93 counts to that indictment. 93 counts, only because it matches the year 1993. Had it been 1925, it would have been 25 counts. Detective Parkman, a ticket from the Long Island Railroad car.
Yes, I'm aware of it.
Does it in any way indicate killings or murders?
Well, I didn't read it completely, but I would think no.
Every piece of information Ferguson comes across is pulled into his delusion and confirms his innocence, even a simple train ticket.
Colin Ferguson was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Guilty.
The strength of Ferguson's delusion is confounding. For him, everything is related to the conspiracy against him. I believe he suffers from delusional disorder of the persecutory type, a condition related to schizophrenia. Those who suffer from it often don't appear psychotic, as their perception in all other areas of life does not seem to be affected by the condition. Once engaged on the topic of their fixation, however, the delusion becomes evident. I place Ferguson at level 15 on my scale of evil, rageful, delusional, multiple killers.
While Colin Ferguson genuinely believed he was not the gunman who had murdered 6 commuters, delusional killer Michael McDermott blamed his actions on an even more extraordinary fantasy.
The last Nazi was there. I shot and killed him. And Hitler was there. I shot and killed him.
Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Stone is examining the impact of delusions, persistent false beliefs, in certain murderers. Delusions can be a powerful force, corrupting minds and motivating vicious behavior. But some scheming criminals claim they are under the influence of delusions in an attempt to avoid responsibility for their heinous acts. 2000, Wakefield, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. Software tester Michael McDermott went on a rampage. Known as Mucko, McDermott gunned down colleagues with a semi-automatic rifle, killing 7. When a police SWAT team arrived, McDermott told them, "I don't speak German." Later, he said he was in purgatory and that his victims were not colleagues at all, but Adolf Hitler and 6 Nazi soldiers. He claimed that an archangel told him that if he killed Nazis, he would earn a soul.
The belief that you are dead or in purgatory is known as Cotard's syndrome, an extremely rare condition often associated with schizophrenia. Those who suffer from it truly believe that their bodies have been taken over and cannot be rationally convinced otherwise. A close examination of his past, however, reveals serious questions about the nature of his delusion.
1970, Marshfield, Massachusetts. The son of two school teachers, Michael McDermott was a bright, inquisitive child. He had a keen interest in mechanics and loved fixing things. He had an active imagination and spent hours absorbed in fantasy books and games. But he later claimed that he had been born without a soul. As an adult, McDermott had a series of technology jobs. He began to suffer from depression and isolated himself by retreating into his inner fantasy world. When his condition grew worse, McDermott attempted suicide by overdosing on anxiety medication and was briefly hospitalized.
Depression can have a devastating impact. It clouds judgment and at times creates a powerful and overwhelming sense of despair. In the case of Michael McDermott, depression is an oppressive reality that he cannot escape.
McDermott seemed to find comfort in his family. He adored his nieces and nephews, who gave him a nickname, Mucko. He embraced the name and even asked his co-workers to use it. But his problems mounted. In 1990, a brief marriage ended in divorce, and he began to have financial difficulties. McDermott owed thousands of dollars in back taxes. His employer docked his wages to repay the debt despite his angry objections. His colleagues began to notice alarming behavior. McDermott drew up a will and asked them to witness it. Finally, he snapped. Using weapons stashed under his desk, McDermott embarked on a massacre, killing 7 people. In court, he claimed his victims were Nazis, and he had killed them to escape purgatory.
The last Nazi was there. I shot and killed him, and Hitler was there. I shot and killed him. My mission was complete. I knew at this point I had a soul.
During his trial, prosecutors provided evidence that McDermott had researched how to fake mental illness. They also revealed that several of his victims were involved in his wage dispute. The jury found McDermott guilty of 7 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 7 life terms.
All indications points to the fact Michael McDermott is faking Cotard's syndrome. He does display the traditional progression of symptoms associated with the disease. A closer examination reveals McDermott to be a disturbed but angry man driven by revenge. By pretending to suffer from a delusional disorder, he uses a conjured-up mental illness as a shield, an extenuating circumstance. In this way, he denies the victims and their families closure. I place him at level 15, multiple vicious acts.
Mad, delusional killers. Research helps us understand the forces behind their vicious acts. Examining these killers offers insight into the human mind's ability to distort reality and reveals the extremes to which some will go to avoid responsibility for their actions. Dr. Stone uses his scale in a quest to understand and quantify evil, and hopes science will one day help prevent these heinous crimes.